Welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog, and I am starting another long piece by Alex Hochuli. One that is related to episodes we did on No Royal Road, which you can find on either the Regrettable Century or the Varn Blog public archives. For me, that's at Buzzsprout, or any podcast aggregator, but you got to go back a couple years, where we covered Evgeny Morozov's New Left Review take on techno-feudalism, the problems that it had. I would also suggest listening to the podcast The Measures Taken, who done episodes on Jodi Dean's version of techno-feudalism, as well as Yanis Faroufakis's. More sympathetic to Dean's than Yanis's, but both of them have some interesting conceptual issues. And I think your Evgeny Morozov's takedown of like Robert Brenner and some of the earlier Jodi Dean work on this is also clarifying. Now, I like a lot of what Jodi Dean has to say, but I think this as a mode of production doesn't really work. However, I want to see what Alex Hochuli says, because he also did a good coverage of the breakdown of the problems of the millennial left about a year back for American Affairs. And we're going to talk about this here. Now, I've talked about some of the weaknesses I've had with Hochuli's work on America, because sometimes it's very clear that his Brazilian and ties to British lefts can sometimes leave him to maybe overassume some things. And we probably have pretty profound disagreements about the possibility of maintaining a left nationalism for a variety of reasons. But I think this is going to be quite useful to talk about. Let's get into the article. Technofeudalism versus Total Capitalism by Alex Hochuli. How to describe decadence. I think decadence is what happens when you have declining profitability on physical commodities paired with hyper specialization and overproduction of elites that services capital, that leaves capital unable to deal with its cost crises, that also has over specialization in terms of energy cost on generating more and more specialized technology, of which the technology itself will eventually try to usurp the roles of specialization, but at even higher energy cost. You can see this is a recipe for disaster. This is Joseph Tainter combined with the AI age, and it's something that I'm working on, although it's not part of any of the two book projects I'm looking at. So who knows if I'll ever write it down. That's why you guys listen to me. But let's talk about the features that Hochuli gets into. It's easier to agree on its features than to arrive on a consensus conceptualization. Economic decline, low productivity growth, that's true for all the major developed capitalist societies and becoming true for China. With its state capacity, that's true for the West, not true for China or Russia. India, I'm unclear. And a social landscape characterized by high inequality, yep, it's true for everywhere, except for some degree in China, although the inequality indexes on China are still higher than you'd expect they'd be for a socialist country. Crumbling infrastructure, that's the West, particularly the United States, but you do see it in Europe and also in Latin America. Although in Latin America, it's also complicated by the fact there's large areas that didn't have the infrastructure in the first place because they were underdeveloped. And Africa has a similar problem on vastly uneven development, even within Africa itself. Go to Lagos, go to Cairo, and then, like, I don't know, go to rural Kenya or Ethiopia and see what you see. It's not going to be the kind of tribal backwaters that are often projected to you by colonial images from the middle 20th century, but it's also not going to be a fully developed, thriving capitalist economy with everything you'd see in like South Korea. But also fused with high-tech innovations, particularly in AI, often directed to surveillance and control of media, and monitoring what everyone's doing, because what else are you going to do when you can't produce anything else to keep people bought in? Let's get back to this article, but that's a good point. The concept de jure is premised on the notion that we are leaving capitalism and entering a new form of feudalism, I mean, who's still creating your food, and is it created by markets? Yes. So no, but okay, that's too simple. Let's give it more than that, even though we probably shouldn't. Which recalls hierarchy, domination, and stagnation of the old. Although hierarchy, domination, and stagnation of the old is talked about in Capitalism by Marx even as early as, I don't know, the Brumaire. So as capitalism is establishing itself in continental Europe. Bah. The understanding of contemporary decline has given rise to the techno-feudal thesis, not just on the left either. The public intellectuals most associated with it is the Greek economist and former finance minister and international playboy and beloved pseudo-martyr, Yanis Faroufakis, who has described capitalism's evolution into something new under the force of big tech and its platform monopolies. His treatment of the subject comes in the form of technofeudalism, what killed capitalism. French economist Cedric Durand, Technofeudalisme, a critique de l'économie numérique, originally published in France in 2020, was the first book-length treatment, and it remains the most complete understanding, earning a translation in English under the title How Silicon Valley Unleashed Technofeudalism, the Making of the Digital Economy. Now, I don't speak French, but I do kind of read it because I read a lot of Latinate languages, and man, that's not a good translation of that title. Okay. Most recently, the political theorist Jodi Dean followed up her 2020 essay, Neo-Feudalism, the End of Capitalism, the book, Capitalism's Grave, Neo-Feudalism, and the New Class Struggle. Now, people have been clearing the new classes forever, but I want to say that if one looks at the criterion of that they put out for neo-feudalism, if you looked at the monopoly capital theories of the 50s and 60s, the same criterion would apply to say those weren't capitalism either. After all, they were about rents, but they were about production in rents, and they were about state involvement and the state involvement in the market, making markets even less market-like. And again, we see that in the techno-neo-feudal thesis. I bring this up because I do think one of the implications, if you accept that techno-neo-feudalism is not capitalism, then you would have to also, I'm just going to see my face here, accept that monopoly capitalism was almost not capitalism, and that goes back to the 1920s, or the managerial society, a la James Burnham and some French elite theorists, was not capitalism, and that goes back even earlier. We're always trying to get out of the problem of capitalism not going away, or getting out of the is socialism or common ruin inevitable problem by positing intermediary categories that still have most of the features of capitalism, and we'll come back to that. But I'm going to see what Alex thinks. I'm probably going to invite him on my show about this too. The provocation that capitalism may be over belongs principally to Mackenzie Wark and her Capitalist Dead, Is There Something Worse?, which appeared in 2019. For Varoufakis, it is a book from which he drew much courage. For Dean, the ideas are dizzying and a call to think again about the assumptions of guiding action and critique, which for left-wing academics is usually a bad sign. That's me adding that, but it's also true. Durand likewise finds something compelling in that account, the emergence of something novel in capitalism's exhaustion. As the compound identifier suggests, the proponents of techno-feudalism thesis believe not only that the future will resemble the pre-capitalist past, which they haven't explained food production or fealty or seniority. Actually, I don't know what elements of feudalism other than rents, which was not a thing that only existed in feudalism, as Eugenie Morozov pointed out, or a lack of markets. And the labor market still exists, my friendo, so you're not a serf. What's going on here? But the technology is essentially implicated in its renascent mode of production. Durant holds Silicon Valley was right in saying the rise of information technology would change everything. I've still not seen the proof of that, other than the physical commodities related to information technologies And the network commodities related to information technologies are much more profitable than the information technologies themselves. AKA, NVIDIA makes a lot more money than AI, which loses a ton. Even though NVIDIA is making money because AI is doing what it's doing. But instead of a libertary, rejuvenating cure, the curse of events instead pointed to degeneration. Now, I think things are degenerating, and I think they've been degenerating since the 1970s. But, I am a noted doomer, so we should listen to Alex and maybe not me. The epochal nature of change is rarely understated. The debate over neo or techno-feudalism is one carried out on Marxist terms, even if it is meant to overturn those same categories of philosophical presumptions. Dean, for instance, argues that against Marxist certainties. She has for a while. Her books, even before this on power law, do this because she doesn't believe in labor theory of value, which was a thing that was super common at the time. And look, Marx's labor theory of value is a critique of classical political and economic labor theories of value, but most people don't get that either. So whatever. Regarding the impossibility of returning to a prior stage of history, but you're not returning to a prior stage of history. Techno-feudalism would be a new thing because you still have markets for labor and food. Just because you are engaging in rents that can be traded actually as commodities and futures trading, by the way, and thus are still kind of quasi-commodities. Just because you're trading in rents doesn't mean the central market interaction that defines the mode of production is not still in a market. Otherwise, you're not dealing with wages. And maybe we are moving there if AI got good enough to do that without massive energy sinks, but we don't have evidence for that yet. Anyway, I'm letting my cards all out on the table. Let me let Alex talk. Pushing back against the view that labor-capital relations are the last possible relation of exploitation in history. Well, there's a common ruin thing. Today, such claims of finality and irreversibility aren't compelling, particularly in the way to defeat of the workers' movement at the end of the 20th century. But that had nothing to do with technology. Unless that technology you mean is diffusion and automation, which happened before the internet. People were talking about the end of that as early as the 1970s. Go read Gorse's The End of the Working Class. That's Gorz. A book I don't like, but was definitely there. If we take the claims of post-capitalist transition at face value, we are not living through a revolutionary moment. For the late Egyptian Marxist Samir Amin, when the transition is made unconsciously or the ideology emanating classes does not allow them to master the process of change, then the social transformation appears to operate like a natural change. Although that's kind of how capitalism emerged from feudalism at first too, only later than it moved from a natural change of the power of the merchant to, particularly after the Black Plague, to the political conscious change of the 17th century. So you had the long calamitous 13th century and then the 17th century and its revolutionary and its nascent revolutionary beginnings bleeding over and exploding into the 18th century. A 300-year process where the natural became something else. Just saying, we're always inventing stuff that we don't need to invent conceptually. But I mean, I actually respect, I think Amin has a point here. In this case, we are dealing with a model of decadence. Now, I read Samir Amin's discussion of decadence on the show and with the Regrettable Century Brothers. And I did not really understand that somehow decadence is that there's a tributary mode that's always around forever, but it was decadence that actually created capitalism because the decadent West didn't have the capacity to build a tributary mode because of geographic and political and feudal problems that it had, which led it to skipping that and developing capitalism. That's a deviation, which it makes it sound like the tributary mode is just a natural mode of humanity, which is weird. And that's not what Samir Amin wants either. So whatever. Just as there was no feudal revolution, Chris Wickman bears to differ, that toppled Rome. So capitalism would appear to be decaying seamlessly into techno-feudalism. But there was no capitalist revolution that happened before the merchants started building agrarian capitalism. The Industrial Revolution happened after capital was established, despite what some Marxist will try to tell you. Marx never argues that. It's the machines that accelerate things, but they did not cause them to come into being. Unless that is we are to grant figures like Elon Musk and Curtis Yarvin a self-conscious vision and mastery of the historical process. I mean, it would be funny if our grandmasters were kidults with an inability to do self-control, but maybe that's always who our feudal lords have been. I don't know. On this note, before engaging more deeply with the authors in the review and a range of associated thinkers who mostly reside on the Marxist or liberal left, it is worth noting that with the other side of the ideological spectrum, decadence has traditionally been the preserve of conservatives and reactionaries. Although that's wrong. I mean, it's not wrong that it's traditionally the preserve of conservatives and reactionaries. It's wrong that we just cede it to them. It is usually of the sub-Spengalian type. So, Oswald Spengler, here we come. The waning of one geographically bound culture or civilization and the waxing of another. The class of civilization, so to speak, and the class of civilizational cultures. This is Dugan. This is a lot of people. The West decline would have it observe in the rise of some imagined civilizing other, be it Islam or China. Pick your poison. They're both in Samuel Huntington, or else in the internal corruption generated by wokeness. Because, there's not like that tendency hasn't been a counter tendency in Western culture going all the way back to fucking Christianity and definitely the Enlightenment, but whatever. China, though, represents an ambivalent figure in the neo-reactionary thought. For the co-founder of Palantir, Peter Thiel, China is to be opposed, but for another, China is a hotbed of innovationist vitality. Nick Land. And I think Hochuli is going to mention that. Going further, Nick Land sees China. He spent a lot of time in Singapore, apparently doing amphetamines, according to some friends of his, although that's allegedly, and I'm going to put allegedly there. Sees in China his vision of an acceleration of future beyond modernity where state and market are united, and also ethnicity is united with the market, but even ethnicity is subject against its more egalitarian trends. I mean, what does Nick Land see as a problem with racialism? It's because it's too nice to the poor white people who are not catching up with the Nietzschean and computer Ubermenschen. Curtis Yarvin was better when he was Mencius Moldbug, and the more he talks, the more he makes even Leo Strauss and Carl Schmitt seem like intellectual god kings. But anyway, it would be consistent with the historical understanding according to which Britain and then the United States once represented capitalism's highest stage of development to now see in China the fullest embodiment of the new and the bad. For those glimpsing a techno-feudal mode of production on the horizon, Chinese wings would carry forth technologies of surveillance and control, often gotten from Israel, as well as a state-capital nexus that is tighter and more monolithic than any in modernity thus far. Varoufakis and Durand toy with elements of this idea. And Oswald Spengler's account of the decline of the West, which I do think people should read. Spengler is fascinating. I did an interview with one of the comrades of the Communist Party Great Britain Provisional Committee who runs Spengler, who also does the Marxism Translated Project. Ben Lewis, who wrote a book on Spengler and Spengelian ideology. You can also check out C.L.R. James' weird writings on Spengler and his book American Civilization, which is a Marxist-Spengelian hybrid about American civilization and by a proxy also the civilizations of the Afro-Caribbean. C.L.R. James did that. C.L.R. James is weirder than most people realize. It's not just his association with Religionskaya and the Marxist humanists. Anyway, let's get back to the text. I'm going on digressions, which maybe that's what you come here for. I don't know what you come here for. In Oswald Spengler's account of the decline of the West, civilizations are aestheticized. Actually, I even think Marxism would talk about the social reproduction of elites being manifest in aesthetics, but, we'll come back to that later. each having its own cultural morphology or physiognomy. There's some weird cultural physiological thinking in Spengler that's actually hard to break down. Go see Ben Lewis's book for that. He's excellent on this point. The West is Faustian, identified by its direction energy, which has an eye on the most distant horizon. Chinese culture, meanwhile, wanders freely here and there, but nonetheless eventually reaches its goal. Decline is merely part of an organic rhythm of birth and decay. The avatars of techno-feudalism, the Silicon Valley oligarchs and their intellectual representatives, have two responses. In one vision, they are Faustian, rescuing the rest from a civilization from decay by going bravely forward to where only robots fear to tread, or don't fear to tread, excuse me. Or the other, alternatively, non-Faustian China is post-human, postmodern, future to be embraced. They are wrong in two ways. First, the brave new world of tech is not Faustian. Instead, it uses the terms described by Marshall Berman. Excellent. People need to read more Marshall Berman. In his unmatched reading of Goethe's Review and the process of modernity as a whole, they are pseudo-Faustian. The great fruits of modernity have their tragic elements. Robert Moses' uprooting of New York neighborhoods is frequent reference in this regard. But while that is part and parcel of development, the pseudo-Faustian is marked instead by a useless theater of cruelty and absurdity. As Berman noted, Stalin's White Sea Canal project sacrificed hundreds of thousands of workers and was, like other similar projects, condemned by heartbreaking fact that they didn't work. I mean, we also sacrificed hundreds of workers for dams, but a lot of them did work in the 30s and 40s. But yeah, we were also doing this whole human sacrifice for capital thing, even in the beginning of the 20th century. The new algorithmic means of surveillance and control were sold as boons to productivity, convenience, and autonomy. And I would actually say early on they kind of were. But they have not produced accelerated economic growth, except in very narrow areas. Basically, 4 of the 7 firms in the Magnificent Seven hold up most of the stock market. Right now, 25% of the stock market as of September of 2025 is held up by the Magnificent Seven, and 4 of them, the ones that produce physical commodities, are doing most of the work. Have fun with that. But they have not produced accelerated economic growth, nor more free time and less drudgery. No, they don't. The opposite, as all automation has done, despite what Keynes predicted. People need to heard Keynes. I mean, yeah, we can talk about Keynes' theory of money, but people need to hold Keynes a lot more accountable for all the shit he got wrong. Only massive fortunes for a few and evident stagnation for many. This is often the case with speculative bubbles. It might not be an insult that would sting most tech oligarchs, but nonetheless, they are not Faustian. Secondly, and more consequently for the declinists of both reactionary and radical types, the sub-Spegelians and the techno-feudal theorists, respectively. I do like Alex casting shade in a category. Anyway, there is no other. Decline can be turned into a geographical game. Our model is failing and theirs is gaining the upper hand in some Cold War redux. But even I think this war is a lot more like the 19th century than the 20th, if it's a war at all. And nuclear weapons and drones and surveillance technology and everything else make the big guys picking on each other directly a lot less likely. They pick on each other through proxies, and woe if you're a small state in a regional hegemon. You got bullied by one party, now you're getting bullied by 3. China has neither a civilizational challenger to the West, nor is it somehow the leading edge of our bad future. It may have pioneered new forms of control, although, like I said, a lot of them were pioneered in Israel. But it remains more economically dynamic precisely by adhering to more radically to capitalist logic. You know, they actually shut down firms that suck. The truth is, there is only one civilization, and this is a truth Joseph Tainter talks about, by the way. He talks about industrial civilization, not capitalism, because sociologists tend to do that, and I think they're wrong to do that, but they want to avoid being called Marxist, I guess. And Tainter's reading of Marx is not particularly great. It's one of the flaws I see in his book. But he is apt to say that a global mode of production is effectively a global civilization. Have a nice day. The aesthetics that are left from the partially decomposed past in these civilizations may rear their head as state justifications, but we're all integrated, even if we're trying to become less so. Capitalism is global and total, and its decay is everywhere. See the decline of GDP everywhere, including China, who's managed this better than any other state. So, what in essence is techno-feudalism? What are the stakes in describing decline in such terms? Yeah, what are they? Debate on the left most recently concerned the diet version of post-capitalist decline thesis. In late 2022, the sociologist Dylan Riley and the economist and doyen of study of the transition of feudalism to capitalism, one whose burner thesis book I have now gone back through and found wanting, but that's behind the Patreon wall. Robert Brenner argued that political capitalism, a new realm of accumulation, was upon us, and that was him abandoning the prior techno-feudalism or neo-feudalism he was flirting with in the teens. This is built on Brenner's piece 2 years earlier, in which he observed the enormous pandemic bailouts and money printing as a politically driven upward redistribution of wealth, which it was. But it's hardly the first time we see that. Whose aim was, quote, to sustain central elements of partly transformed dominant capitalist class as a response to a seemingly inexorable process of economic deterioration. And Hochuli tried to point that out. In the recent debate, including a shorter piece by Riley in 2023, concerned American institutional politics, class coalitions, and Biden's economic policy. It's one that I kind of was hard on. Actually, and I'm not sure that was the Riley one I was hard on. I think it was the joint Riley Brenner one I was hard on, the thesis on Bidenism, which I kind of ripped apart. Coincidentally, responses largely revolved around political strategy, whether the left could keep favoring the policies as already favored industrial policy, which it kind of can't, are a cross-class Green New Deal style alliance in favor of real industrialization would lead, in Riley's word, to a massive exacerbation of the problems of overcapacity on a world scale, putting sharper pressure on the returns of some private capital, which was crowded in by market-making industrialization policies. For Riley, rather about New Deals and sepia-toned Rooseveltiologia should be exposed for what it is, a backwards-facing obstacle to the establishment on socialism. Well, I actually agree with him on that. I'm fucking tired of hearing about new fucking deals that never fucking happen, and also wouldn't necessarily be good after their initial developmentalism. But the problem is both industrial policy and Green New Deal stuff are both developmental policies for developed economies that are already mostly developed. Bah! All right. If Riley and Brenner are correct in their analogy, then the reformist politics advanced in Jacobin and elsewhere are indeed a path to nowhere, which they may be. And I've kind of thought that for a long time. Remember, I used to call Jacobin Gerontian magazine, and we got really pissed off and started calling it a Leninist magazine, but no one gets the joke. Because I guess you have to be a French Revolution nerd to understand what the hell I'm talking about, and people will start calling me a enragé and talking about how I don't speak French, which you're right about, by the way. So let's continue. And Yelps of protest are a little more than let's have our political attachments, whatever the consequences. Yet, as Benjamin Fong rightly notes in Damage, I need to read this. The eventual problems of industrial overcapacity are capitalist problems, not an objective limit. That's absolutely true. There is no ceiling to what humanity can dream of, manufacture, and build out, only an economic system whose irrationality adheres precisely to the need for activity to be profitable and thus grow. This is one of the issues with degrowth and growth communism, is they're talking about things in capitalist terms as if it would make sense to do that in a post-capitalist society. When I've critiqued degrowth, it's not because I've said that we need things to grow infinitely. I don't even know exactly what that would mean, but the terms of the debate are explicitly capitalist ones, and we should be more talking about sustainability, certain kinds of production that are sustainable. And when I see what some of the degrowthers put as their policies beyond, not growing stuff, returning 50% of the population to agriculture is a pretty fucking bad idea. All right. There is no ceiling to what humanity can dream of, manufacture, and build out, only an economic system whose rationality inheres precisely to the need for activity to be profitable. And in the redundancy of competitive production and things like planned obsolescence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There isn't too much steel being produced. There are plenty of trains and bridges that could build the world over that aren't being built. And maybe we should build them in more copacetic ways with nature and use the steel more wisely, but we could do that. Such as Faustian or Promethean gambit, those are not the same thing, by the way. Not as metaphors anyway, but we can go into that. Should be borne in mind as we examine the full-fat version of post-capitalist decline thesis, otherwise known as techno-feudalism. Varoufakis' argument is most easily reduced, as he justifies discarding capitalism for techno-feudalism with the reference to the simple truth of the triumph of rent over profit. And he also talks about this in terms of the decline of Marx, but neither here nor there. Morozov points out that rents have been part of market profitability all the way back to the fucking 16th century, so I don't know what you're talking about. And Marx even explicitly writes about rents being turned into a form of new commodities which could be traded, which they can under English common law, in capital. So how is this new again? I mean, the scale of it's new, and there's truth that if something scales up enough, it becomes a different kind of thing. But that's not really what's been argued yet. There is much about clouds and platforms and rents, but rather little on what feudalism is. Yeah, because feudalism isn't just rentierism. It's more than that. And less still on ideas and being, that is, the ideological and subjective facets of this new epoch. He also has a somewhat awkward book. Its conceit is that to the letter to his late father, who acts as an imaginary foil for the son and as an authority figure in the judgment of his argument. It has its endearing elements, like Varoufakis' admiration for his father's learning and wisdom. I mean, I would love to admire my father. I do kind of admire my stepfather. Sorry, that's way too personal. Let's go on. As one wonders if charm and charisma are going to carry the weight where logic and depth of insight should be. Puzzlingly, Varoufakis reserves the systemic analysis for the appendix, where finally we learn of the relationship between capitalist economy and the techno-feudal one. Even here, though, there is little deep historical or social vision, and like no discussion of what feudalism actually was and how it fucking worked. Because the thing that made feudalism not capitalism was that not that markets didn't exist, they did. It was that the wage form was not the predominant form of society, and most things were geared towards direct extraction of material wealth, not abstract value. And thus there are limits on that, hard limits on that, which is why feudal economies didn't seem to grow very much. That's also why they had more downtime than we did, even if their lives were pretty fucking hard. And they were. All right. Here, there's a little deep historical and social vision. So we are left to conclude that neo-feudalism is really nothing more than formula rents is greater than profit, which is essentially misguided, as we will see below. Dean's limitations are other, and I agree with this. I actually think Dean's book has more to defend for it. I recently read the book, and I was not as unimpressed as I thought I was going to be, but I still don't buy the central argumentation. If you want to see why, I think actually Stefan Hamill and the gang over at The Measures Taken really do a good job of talking about what she sees as correct and what the limits of her book are, which is still about the problems of markets. Too much is so evident, and if it isn't, she'll tell you it is. Supposedly, the omnipresent feudal images and languages that is the ether today captures our uneasy sense of decay and decline in the context of intensifying inequality. Dean rules theory as a burlap sack. Ooh, ouch. Capacious but unstructured, ultimately a tool in which to bash the readers over the head. We learned that 90% of app-based drivers in New York City are recent immigrants, most of whom are from Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. This suggests an exclusion from the labor market based on immigration status linked to imperialism and climate change. Except that we've always put immigrant workers in the shittiest areas of the economy, including the most precarious ones. That's kind of how capital accumulation has developed internally, like forever. See Marxist writing on the Irish. Anyway, it is a style of vulgar leftist argumentation in which all bad things can be put in a bag on the right and the good things on the left, and away we go. But contradictions abound. Feudalism is supposedly just an analytic lens, a metaphor. Yeah, but feudalism isn't a fucking metaphor. It's a mode of production. Well, it's a mode of political economy. It's not just a mode of production, because capitalism, according to Marx, is a fully instantiated mode of production, where feudalism wasn't. But we can go into that. One which uses changes in how we see capitalism by drawing out what it is becoming. Yet, in the introduction, we were told that feudalism isn't a formation confined to the European past, although it usually is a formation confined to the European past. It is a colonial arrangement with ongoing effects, but colonialism has long been part of capitalism. It's part of the accumulation matrix of capitalism, and most leftists, regardless of their theories of capital, have agreed with that, including non-Marxist ones. Not all liberals have, though. And some Marxist-ish thinkers, with some Lassalleans didn't in the 19th century, and there were pro-imperialist parts of the Second International, the far right that we don't even talk about anymore. When people talk about the Second International right, they're actually usually talking about the Second International Center and then maybe Bernstein. All right. Yet in the introduction, we were told that feudalism is the formation of the European past, but a colonial arrangement with the ongoing effects. And so it isn't just a metaphor, it's an operating system for the present. This is literally fashion feudalism. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it has the same problem. There are some strengths here, though. I think there are more strengths in Dean's book than I do in Varoufakis's. And both Hochuli and me and the measure taking guys agree with that. First, the political and subjective aspects of the new social order are actually given due consideration. We're not faced just with new lords and serfs, the by now hackneyed portrayal of inequity, but also parcelated sovereignty, hinterlandization, and catastrophic anxiety. But you can go to Phil Nil for that and have that better explained. Moreover, the section of the core periphery relations and temporalities is well developed, looking at how, quote, the process long directed outwards through colonialism and imperialism are turning inward in ways that undermine the capitalist laws of motion and repeat accumulation strategies typical of feudalism. Rent-seeking, plunder, and political control. But this is also like what capitalism does in a crisis. See, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, by Lenin, or imperialism by Bukharin, or even parts of ultra imperialism by Kautsky, or John Smith's imperialism in the 21st century, or I can go on, and these books don't agree with each other, but they all have this in common. They don't agree with the mechanisms which are at work that cause this, but they all think this is happening. All right, some of this alerts us to what should be present in any discussion of decline. The way significant parts of the core countries are coming to resemble those of the periphery, aka labor aristocracy doesn't work anymore if you're a Maoist, or maybe we're becoming equal in our undevelopment if you're, me. Not just in terms of inequality or corruption, but in a growing informal service class, which has been around for a long fucking time and was only not around in the industrial high point of capitalism in Europe and the United States and Canada, and was never abolished in places like where Hochuli's running Brazil, or most of Latin America or Africa, or you have a whole class of people who are not even deindustrialized, but also never industrialized and de-agrarianized. Private capital's dependence on the state and the greater use of state violence. And also, I would argue, a greater amount of organic capital, aka fixed capital, which does not spill into as much jobs, thus not spreading wealth around the same way for nations who get like factories in them. Phil Neal is excellent on this point. Durand's account is the most cynic and complete, and almost the most circumspect, aware as it is of extant tendencies that contradict the central argument. I think I need to read Durand's book because I like reading the best versions of things, and I found Varoufakis unconvincing. I found Jodi Dean to be interesting, but not entirely convincing. I found Brenner and Riley to be kind of maddening, although smart in points. And let's move on. He begins by laying out the so-called Californian ideology. That thing comes back in and pursues a daft critique of it from the inside. A deft critique of it, not daft. Oops. Those words mean the opposite thing. Deft critique of it. The method acts as a brake on too much eclecticism. Thank God. the kind in which everything starts to look suspiciously feudal if you stare at it too long, which I could do with anything, like you pay rents to me for Patreon, and that makes me your feudal digital lord, even though I don't provide you food, or you don't provide me food either. Even, yeah, you can see how this one doesn't work. Instead, he discusses the new technologies of domination and looks at the way in which the economy, resting on intangible asset function before attempting to reconstruct historic feudalism and the features of it that recur today. Now, I want to say that I actually at one time found this shift to rentier economy fascinating, but I never thought it was feudal. I thought it was showing a problem in profitability that people were ignoring by looking at other forms of wealth transfers that weren't really the creation of new abstract value, except in valuations, which may or may not be real when you actually try to sell shit on the market. So people don't sell shit on the market, at least in terms of assets, because it could risk showing that they're not as worth as much as they're valued at. There's a lot of leverage in that, which is why there's then a lot of debt based on perceived asset value and not selling assets on the market. And that is a shift from the early 20th century, but that does not feudalism make. Unless you define feudalism really, really thinly, maybe people do. All right. Instead, he discusses new technologies of domination and looks at the way in which an economy resting on intangible asset functions before attempting to reconstruct historic feudalism and the features that occur in it today. And I think this actually is important. The more you rely on rents, the more you do need state intervention to maintain those rents, because someone's got to grant you a monopoly, and that monopoly has to be through violence, and you have to have a grantor that enables you to establish a monopoly on violence within your society. Otherwise, it's a war of all against all, motherfuckers. And if I got a big enough drone set, then you're screwed. It's like one of the most provocative things I ever said to a union is like, I'd take a packet of drones if we needed to deal with a strike. They don't even need to be armed. All right. Instead, he discusses the new technologies of domination and looks at the way in which the economy is resting on intangible asset functions before attempting to reconstruct historic feudalism and the features of it that recur today. If there is a formal weakness, it is that after claiming rightly that to fixate on display dimensions of IT systems would be to overlook the economic underpinnings, his concrete examples of data platforms don't build a convincing case as to capitalism's passing. And Eugenie Morozov talks about this too in his New Left piece that you should go and check out. What does it matter, though, whether we accept the case being made or not? For Durand, the identifying paradoxical resurgences of feudal logics, even in societies where market production has become generalized, that last bit's a big caveat, strikes at both the liberal assumptions about capitalist competition and its only real adversary, the Marxist tradition. That is to say, to accept techno-feudalism means you can't hold that capitalism still works the way it should, and that this is good, nor that capitalism still works the way it should, and that this is bad. Dean is of the same view. If commodity production continues to drive capital accumulation, then Marxist critiques remain appropriate. If, however, accumulation depends on rents, predation, and plunder, then the attention to neo-feudalizing tendencies allow us to gap and fight the emerging forms of social domination. But the problem is, what if the rents and the commodities become the same thing on the market? That did not happen in feudalism. There's no analogy to it in feudalism. It takes capital to make futures trading make sense. I'll continue. Also, clearly, we're not going to finish this entire article today. Hopefully, this will not be another 7-part marathon that, like I did for the last Hochuli article I covered. But we'll see where we're going to get. It is not a matter of accounting for stagnation, but of naming the enemy. This bears with its further stakes, as we will see. In the debate on techno-feudalism, you either be guilty of nostalgia for capitalism or turning a blind eye to decline. More than this, are the techno-feudal theorists reconstructing the old, already defeated enemy, the aristocracy? As tech critic Eugenie Morozov wrote earlier in an earlier review of the literature, thank you for finally citing it. It's an excellent article. It is that as if the less theoretical framework can no longer make sense of capitalism without mobilizing the moral language of corruption and perversion. But we already did that in our critiquing capitalism as consumerism shit in the 70s. Varn go mad, smash. Smash idea. Bad idea. All right. You can see that I'm sympathetic to Hochuli's argument, even though I don't think like Jodi Dean's book is trash. I actually don't think that. I thought I was going to think that. I thought her first article wasn't particularly great, but I do think there's interesting thing in it that we have to wrestle with. And I haven't read the Durand book. I read a lot of the other books on neo-feudalism and techno-neo-feudalism and techno-feudal, neo-serf feudalism and political capitalism and power law capitalism and whatever fuck Mackenzie Wark was talking about when she did her thing. Yeah. I know I sound contemptuous. I do think these debates are important. One of the reasons why I've been talking about Chris Wickman and Rodney Hilton and the Marxist theorists of feudalism is because feudalism is a weird problem for Marxism because it has more than one mode of production and even multiple concentric kinds of laws, church laws, local municipality laws, laws of guilds, which are all binding and sometimes in a life or death manner. For example, when you realize this, when you talk about like endogenous theories of money, state theory of money and legal theory of money, which a lot of people think are the same thing, become not the same thing. It's an insight Colin Drum has had more than once. It's something you have to kind of deal with. Plus, internal competition often creates different forms of money because different levels of trust between different actors are, well, different. And so if you look at in both exogenous and endogenous monies, there are going to be different times in which they're used. And yes, Virginia, there's multiple kinds of monies. We now refer to money mostly as fiat currency backed by Forex exchange banks, which are backed by large holdings, people with giant militaries who also have massive production power. But try tying any one commodity, even the petro exchange, to any singular currency, and you're going to have a problem. But there's been a problem with this recently because you start seeing that the BRICS has just always been buying gold to offset the economic power of the dollar without making their own currency subject to the international market the way the dollar is, and thus fucking up their internal market policy. They've been buying gold, and you've really seen that kick up in the last year. What's happening? My MMT friends do have to explain that. Not that I reject all their stuff about chartalism or internal money. I actually don't. And I do think Marx wrote that off too prematurely. I mean, he mentions it as a possibility in like a couple of places. One when talking about why they can't do it because of international competition, making that unlikely. He does talk about other things than gold or commodity money could be used, which people often ignore when they're Marxist gold bugs. And yes, such a thing really does exist. But that had to do with state competition and trading between states. And he thought that was necessary because capitalism was an international phenomenon, not just a national economy one. Which is why capitalism with nationalist characteristics is going to lead to quicker declines. And why I'm not a neoliberalist on tariffs, and I think sometimes they're appropriate, but like you got to be careful with that because it'll accelerate the decline internal to your own economy, particularly if you're already very developed. And most of the developmental economic studies, both Keynesian and Marxist, back that up. It's hard to get people to think about this shit. Because they're not disciplined enough to look at long durée things. Anyway, we're about a fourth of the way through this article, and we've been going for an hour, and I don't want to do another 4-hour article. So I'm ending this. See you guys soon. Protect your peace, like and subscribe, hit the bell, and join us in the future tomorrow. If you want to support us, you can support us for as little as $4 a month. And if you don't want to support us, but you still want to be involved, you can write a comment for Algorithm, go find my podcast and leave a good review. People haven't been doing that as much lately. No one's been doing it on any format. I think Apple podcasts are just not used as much, so it's hard to know where those reviews are going. And there's probably some podcasts that appreciate that because they've changed format and man, their audience don't love it no more, but whatever. On all that said, come back and finish this with me soon enough. All right. Let's end on some manic pixie Varn energy. And call it a day. Protect your peace. Keep yourself together. Have a great day.